This is a critical screencast. We'll be discussing two very important Texas Penal Code definitions, restrain and abduct. Note, these are just definitions. They aren't criminal offenses. Despite what you've seen on television and the movies and what you know these words to mean in regular everyday usage, their legal penal code meanings are very different. First, according to the penal code, restrain means to restrict a person's movements without consent so as to interfere substantially with the person's liberty by moving the person from one place to another or by confining the person. So if you think very carefully about this legal definition of the word restrain, it's almost the opposite of what you'd expect and seems to be more fitting of the term abduct or abduction as it's used in its non-legal settings such as television or the movies. We often equate moving someone against their will with an abduction or kidnapping, but not necessarily so in the penal code. That concept applies to the term restrain. Let's try to clarify this further. According to the penal code definition of restrain we just examined, does the woman in this picture have to be tied up in order to be considered to have been restrained? Does she even have to be in the trunk to be considered restrained? Look at the definition and you'll see the answer is not necessarily. Those details are less important than answering the question of whether or not her movements were restricted without consent in a way that substantially interferes with her liberty, and was it done by either moving her from one place to another or by confining her? So if a defendant places this woman in the trunk of his car without her consent and then either keeps her there or drives off with her, the defendant has restrained her according to the penal code definition. The penal code goes on to state that restraint without consent is accomplished by force, intimidation, or deception. Restraint without consent is also accomplished by any means, including acquiescence or agreement of the victim, if it is a child 14 or younger, or an incompetent person and the parent or guardian has not agreed to the movement or confinement. Restraint without consent is also accomplished by any means, including acquiescence, again, agreement of the victim, if the victim is 14 to 17 years old and taken outside of the state and outside a 120-mile radius from the victim's residence. So once again, according to the penal code, restrain means to restrict a person's movements without consent so as to interfere substantially with the person's liberty by moving the person from one place to another or by confining the person. Remember, restrain is a definition, not an offense. This doesn't really get complicated until we contrast the definition of restrain with the definition of abduct. A common mental image of an abduction is somebody being taken against their will, tied up, thrown in a van, and driven off. But under the penal code, abduct means to restrain a person with intent to prevent his liberation by secreting or holding him in a place where he is not likely to be found, or using or threatening to use deadly force. So the term restrain is actually part of the definition of abduct, and you can have physically moved someone against their will and only be considered to have restrained them. You haven't automatically abducted them. What will probably trip you up further is, according to the penal code, you don't have to physically move someone from one place to another in order to abduct them. You merely need to hold them in a place where they're not likely to be found. So let's try to illustrate these with two examples. In the orange box is the broken down definition of restrain, and the red box has the broken down definition of abduct. Remember, part of the definition of abduct is to have restrained someone. You have to have both the orange and the red box together to equal abduct. Now, let's say a man goes to his ex-girlfriend's apartment. He tells her to get in the car, and she says, "I don't want to." And he responds with, "Get in the car or else." And that's a pretty vague threat, and it certainly doesn't involve a threat of deadly force. She does what he says, she's intimidated, and he then drives off with her and takes her to his house. He has restricted her without her consent and interfered with her liberty by moving her. He has definitely restrained her under the penal code definition. But has he abducted her? Only if he has done these three things, plus prevented her liberation by secreting or holding her somewhere or threatening deadly force. He has moved her from one place to another against her will and hasn't yet abducted her. On the other hand, let's say a student goes to class on Friday afternoon at the very end of the day. After the class, the professor asks the student to stay after. After everyone else is gone, the professor tells the student he can't leave and tells him if he doesn't stay, he'll kill him and points a firearm at him. Has the professor restricted the student's movements without consent and interfered with his liberty by confining him? He has. In addition, is he preventing his liberation by threat of deadly force? Yes, again. You might even be able to argue the professor is holding him in a place where he's not likely to be found, assuming there aren't any other classes in that room and no one will be there until Monday morning. So in this example, the professor has abducted the student without ever having moved the student out of the room. Keep in mind, restrain and abduct are definitions used in later criminal offenses, such as the crimes of unlawful restraint, kidnapping, and aggravated kidnapping. Unlawful restraint is the least serious among the kidnapping, smuggling, and trafficking offenses identified in the Texas Penal Code. A person who intentionally or knowingly restrains another person has committed the offense of unlawful restraint. Remember, restrain has a very specific definition and means to restrict a person's movements without consent so as to interfere substantially with their liberty by either moving the person from one place to another or by confining the person. The Penal Code identifies an affirmative defense to unlawful restraint to reconcile situations where a parent or legal guardian is exercising their parental rights. The Penal Code states it is an affirmative defense to unlawful restraint if the person is 14 or younger, the actor was a relative of the child, and the actor's sole intent was to assume lawful control of the child. The Penal Code also has language to reconcile situations between juveniles and younger adults that might arise and that we would consider less serious than a full-blown adult offense. The Penal Code states it is an affirmative defense to unlawful restraint if the person restrained was 14 to 17 years old, the actor was not more than 3 years older than that person, and the actor doesn't restrain them by force, intimidation, or deception. Finally, the Penal Code sets forth an exception for law enforcement officers by stating it is not an offense to detain or move another as part of a lawful arrest or detention. If the victim is a judge or peace officer in the course of discharging their duty, or the offense is committed against or in retaliation for an official duty performed by a judge or peace officer, the offense is a felony of the second degree. A person who recklessly exposes the victim to a substantial risk of serious bodily injury in the course of committing unlawful restraint has committed a felony of the third degree. If the victim is a known public servant on duty, or if the actor was in custody of law enforcement, it is also a felony of the third degree. If the victim is 17 or younger, the offense is a state jail felony. And finally, all other offenses under this statute are A misdemeanors. We'll discuss the Texas Penal Code offense of kidnapping in this screencast. An actor who intentionally or knowingly abducts another person has committed the Penal Code offense of kidnapping. As we have previously discussed, abduct has a very specific definition, and you can abduct a person without having physically moved them from one place to another. Abduct means to restrain a person with intent to prevent his liberation by secreting or holding him in a place where he is not likely to be found, or using or threatening to use deadly force. So, a major difference between the Penal Code offense of unlawful restraint and kidnapping are those two terms we've previously put so much emphasis on. If you intentionally or knowingly restrain someone, you've committed unlawful restraint. If you intentionally or knowingly abduct someone, you've committed kidnapping. There is an affirmative defense to kidnapping if it is not coupled with the intent to use or threat to use deadly force, the actor was a relative of the person abducted, and the actor's sole intent was to assume lawful control of the victim. All kidnapping offenses are felonies of the third degree. Aggravated kidnapping is obviously a more serious offense than kidnapping and involves the offense of kidnapping coupled with very specific circumstances. A person commits aggravated kidnapping if they intentionally or knowingly abduct another person with the intent to hold them for ransom or reward, use them as a shield or a hostage, facilitate the commission of a felony or the flight after that felony, inflict bodily injury, violate or abuse the victim sexually, terrorize the victim or a third, which means another person, say a relative or friend of the victim, interfere with the performance of a governmental or political function, or finally, use or exhibit a deadly weapon. All aggravated kidnapping offenses are felonies of the first degree. If the defendant is able to prove at trial he or she voluntarily released the victim, in other words, they figured out on their own it was a bad idea and let the victim go without being forced to by police or anyone else, then they may be punished with a felony of the second degree.